So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Doyne Farmer. I count it a real pleasure to consider Doyne both a colleague and a friend. We've known each other since around 1989 or 90 when we bumped into each other at Los Alamos. Doyne was a professor at the Santa Fe Institute for many years before recently moving to INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford, and he remains an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. And I asked Doyne to try to give us a somewhat broader perspective on quantitative approaches to understanding complex systems, including finance and financial markets, that can be valuable in understanding them in a more general way while including the ability to make predictions about their future. Doyne?
Sure. Thanks. So, nice to be here. I guess in thinking about this talk and what the theme is, listening to seeing what you've had so far, I'm almost tempted to say I should have given another talk on market ecologies that actually Bob May and I both spoke at a meeting on that a couple of weeks ago. But on the other hand, I think maybe what I'm going to do now is a good let's say, counterpoint to what you've been seeing so far. And I would say that if you want to, early warning signals is very much about prediction. You're making a sort of qualitative prediction. An early warning signal might not tell you detail. It's telling you, but there's something to worry about there. Be careful. So I'm going to step back and think about prediction in general. In my experience, I've done three things, two and a half things in my life that involve making serious practical predictions. One of them was predicting the game of roulette, where when I was in graduate school, Norman Packard and I and some friends got together and used physics to beat the game of roulette. Then after my 10 years at Los Alamos, because I got tired of people saying, have you applied this to stock market? And I got terrified they were going to give me the 10-year nut dish. I left and started a company that predicted the stock market called Prediction Company. And now I'm involved in agent-based modeling. So I'm going to give you my vision for agent-based modeling for economics, but maybe try and also stress some lessons about prediction in general and early warning systems in particular. And in my experience, on one hand, I'm a complex systems person. I believe in the holistic vision that Martin was just giving you. But at the same time, I think it's limited because you only get so far speaking in very generic ways. And at a certain point, you have to roll up your sleeves and actually deal with the specifics of a problem. And in my experience at both Prediction Company and doing roulette, you can get a certain distance with generic forecasting methods, but you can do significantly better if you can actually make a fundamental model. And maybe a slight digression, I think there's two basic ways to predict something. One is to use what I would call the method of analogs. You take a lot of data, you find things in the data that resemble things, your situation now. You go back in the historical record and you look forward in the data and you see what happened after the situation that resembles where you are now. And you use that to make your forecast. And that's the basis of statistical methods of time series forecasting, what in economics is called econometrics. That's the way they used to forecast the weather. Now, the alternative are fundamental models, where you make a model of the world based on something like physics. You model each of the pieces, you model the interactions of those pieces. You then have a fundamental model that if you can put initial conditions into, you can make predictions. And in roulette, for example, I did this both ways. I initially did it with physics. The physical model, it turns out, was the best way to do it. But it required a fairly sophisticated user that understood the way the model was built well enough to set the parameters in a nonlinear setting. You had to have some intuition in the user. I then built a sort of automated statistical model. And the automated statistical model was great because the user didn't have to do anything. The user just clicked data in, and the statistical model would just make the forecasts. But it never did as well as the first model I built that involved the sophisticated user who had to actually understand something about the physics to make it work. Now, so what I'm going to talk about today is the more detailed approach. And I realize, let's see, All right. So, and I'm gonna also give you a little bit of my own personal vision. That is, when around the time, around 5 years ago, around the time of the financial crisis in 2008, I stepped back from my own life and said, okay, what have I done, and what should I do with the rest of my life? Because I'm getting old enough, I have to think about things like that. And I said, well, my academic work, I think it's been pretty good, but actually the thing I've gotten the most recognition for, I've been most proud of, have been the two things I mentioned: roulette, beating the market. We're not really academic endeavors. So how can I put all this together, do something good for the world, make use of my expertise in prediction? And I said, okay, I'm going to try and predict the economy and be able to predict things like the next financial crisis. But I want to make a general remark before I step into that, which is about what the slide's about, noting also that in natural sciences and physical sciences, the computer has completely revolutionized the way science works. I think if I look back and ask what's been the biggest effect on physical or natural science since 1960, I'd say it's the computer. If you look at social science in contrast, I don't think you can really say the same thing. It's been very important, but I don't think the potential has been realized, and I think that's particularly true in economics. Now, what is my vision? My vision, what I'd like to have, I'm 62 now, by the time I'm 70, I'd like to be doing a real-time tandem simulation of all the economies of the world. I'd like to be inputting data directly from the internet, from every source I can get, so I don't have to wait on the slow wheels of the national accounting systems that take years to get proper data to turn. I'd like to have something that would be widely used by central banks and maybe even treasuries. And I guess I imagine teams focusing on each component of the model. So you'd have a team that really worries about households. What are households thinking now? Is our household model good enough? Are we capturing the mood and the mechanics of what households are doing right now? Another one that's worrying about firms, another one that worries about banks. Namely, each team worries about the central components of the economy. You put them all together and you get predictions out. Now, so you forecast things like unemployment, economic prosperity. By the way, I would not try to forecast the stock market or interest rates because I think those things are actually pretty darn random. They're not completely random. That's how I made my modest fortune. But even if you do well, like Prediction Company made very good predictions in the financial context, we were right 55% of the time. It's still a pretty noisy world. Markets are pretty efficient. So we wouldn't forecast that. But conditioned on these movements or averaging over them, I think you can forecast things about unemployment or economic prosperity because these things aren't traded. I'm also very interested in making a modern integrated assessment model for the economy-environment interactions. Some of you might have noted there was a recent report from a commission headed by Calderon that said, basically, we don't believe that confronting global warming will be as expensive as people have been saying it is. I completely agree with that. But unfortunately, you look through the report and they don't have very strong evidence for that. There's been a series of models by people like Bill Nordhaus arguing that it is going to be pretty expensive. I don't believe a single word of those models. But we've got to have the alternative. And again, we've got to have a good model for the economy if we're going to do that. Because I think that, while I strongly support the kind of efforts you heard about in the last talk, I think they're very interesting and useful. Nonetheless, to really do this right, I think we have to actually, the devil is in the details, and we have to plunge in and get those details. And this is kind of related to, to go back and connect to my remark about why computation hasn't been as effective in the social science or hasn't even been pursued as much. I think it's because of the lack of underlying laws. And weather, it was sort of obvious early on that we needed to go from having a bunch of guys using the method of analog staring at weather maps to actually having a physical simulation of the details of the economy. We have the laws to do it, although actually when you look you look closely, you see actually we didn't quite have the laws, because if you look at something like the transmission of heat from water to air, it's not just a straightforward thing. Cloud formation is not at all straightforward. You can't derive it from Newton's laws. So actually you've had to do a lot of the kind of more empirical things that you end up doing when you do social science. I mean, my inspiration for this is Harry Seldon, Isaac Asimov. Some of you might have read the Foundation trilogy. I read it in high school, and it inspired me. I went back and reread it as an adult, and actually I was surprised. I still thought it was pretty good. But it's a great example of early warning. In this book, he imagines there's this guy, Harry Seldon, and this videotape when he dies appears, and he says it's an early warning. The galaxy, civilization in the galaxy is about to collapse. And with the theory of psychohistory, we kind of understand why. And so now we're going to try and actually engineer to keep that collapse. He said we can't prevent the collapse, but rather than having it, wipe out galactic civilization for 50,000 years, maybe we can reduce the time to a few hundred years that the world goes into this or the universe or the galaxy goes into this barbaric state. So, so he had also the vision, as Asimov in there, of a predictive social science, and I do think that's a vision worth doing. Now, I put in this remark about one-to-one simulation because that is my goal. I'd like to have ideally as close as possible to a one-to-one simulation. Well, a lot of people would say, well, that's not science. In fact, I remember when I was interviewed for Melanie Mitchell's Complex Systems MOOC, she asked me that question. Do you think that's science, and would it be useful to have a one-to-one simulation? So, because, Jeff West might challenge how useful that would be. I don't know. For example, I don't know. If Jeff were here, we could have it be fun. I say it's a no-brainer how useful it would be. Imagine if we actually had the one-to-one simulation, then first of all, we could anticipate by simulating forward things that were going to happen, and secondly, we would be able to do sophisticated policy experiments, because the problem is we only have one world. That one world moves slowly. If we actually could have a one-to-one simulation based on fundamental principles where we can do what-if experiments, then we can actually see which policy we'd rather follow, because we can look at the outcomes going forward and get a much better feeling for what might happen. So I think such a thing would be incredibly useful. I want to stress that you'll never get that from the method of analogs. The method of analogs can tell you if the world is sufficiently stationary, if you've really seen something in the past that's like what you have now, you can look forward and see what would happen next. There are two problems with that. One problem that's a fundamental problem is the curse of dimensionality. The weather or the economy are very high dimensional systems, so it's actually very hard to find a good nearest neighbor. Okay, even though in principle say the weather is deterministic, finding an exact replica of today's weather pattern, looking back through the historical record, you actually never get all that close because the system is very high dimensional. The second problem is that, and it's not as big, well, it's a problem for weather once you're dealing with global warming. It's a bigger, even bigger problem in the economy because the economy is evolving quickly. And as you go through time, you're never going to find a replica of what's happening now. In the past, you might find something that had a few features in common, but the 2008 crisis is a fairly unique event. And to really understand that event, you need a fundamental simulation that allows you to think about that event. Now, so just to say, agent-based models, this is another complex system theme that SFI has been participated in since the beginning. Agent-based models are, I'm really now talking about computational agent-based models that explicitly model the microstates of individual agents or heterogeneous groups of agents. So I say it that way to stress that actually all economic models, theoretical models, are agent models. It's a question of how you model the agent. Is the agent doing rational expectations, and are you assuming that there's just a representative agent that can represent all households? Or are you actually saying, well, the world's more complicated than that. We really have to get in and simulate different agents because different agents have different effects. And in a nonlinear world, having lots of different agents doing different things can't be captured by a single representative agent. The representative agent idea only works when the world is linear. Just to give you a feeling for how mainstream economics looks at agent-based modeling, this appeared in Krugman's blog now 4 years ago. okay, there's a silly joke here because there's another economist called Roger Farmer that he knows. I don't think he knows me. I was one of the people who got all excited about the possibility of getting somewhere with a very detailed agent-based models. That was 20 years ago. After all this time, it's all still manifestos and promises of great things one of these days. Now, I am going to somewhat play into that stereotype by talking about promises and manifestos and visions. I am going to argue that we've actually already done some pretty important stuff, and I'm not sure I have. Well, I'm going to do that too. I think there's a slow change happening, agent-based modeling. I think there's a little bit of waking up, and I'll explain why, to why that's important. Now, maybe I don't need to talk too much about why agent-based modeling isn't the mainstay of economics. I think the reasons are anthropological. I don't think it's because it's not the right way to go. It's because it's anthropological, and the mindset and scientific culture you need to do agent-based modeling is very different than the one that's evolved in economics. I think that's a kind of a symmetry-breaking phenomenon. Has actually to do with Ken Arrow. Ken Arrow, in the 50s, imported mathematics into economics in a pretty dramatic way that essentially sent mathematicians scrambling. Lots of mathematicians got imported into economics. There weren't a lot of physicists imported into economics. The course would have been very different had things gone that way. I'm going to kind of move along because I realize I want to make sure I get to the end of my talk. There's also another important thing that can't be discounted called the Lucas critique. The mainstream of economics up until the 70s were following along the footsteps of Keynes, who I would argue is very much a dynamical systems, complex systems kind of thinker, though Keynes himself was not a real mathematician. And wasn't really making very mathematical models, but the stories he was telling are very much along those lines. Followers of his used something called the Phillips curve, which said that that rising prices are correlated with rising employment. And in the late 70s, we were stuck in something that's come to be called stagflation. Well, actually, we were having high unemployment. And so the people running the Fed said, well, maybe we can get out of that because we know that there's a correlation between rising employment and rising prices. So maybe if we just create some inflation, we'll actually be able to pull out of the bad unemployment we have now. So they tried it, and what they got was unemployment and inflation, which came to be called stagflation, and which is worse than either one of them by itself. Now, so this actually caused a whole rethinking in economics, led by Milton Friedman, Lucas, Tom Sargent, several others, saying that we've got to have micro-founded economic models that incorporate the reasoning of individuals into the model so that we can deal with the fact that people, they argued the reason we got stagflation is people could see through the veil of inflation, and they just saw that it was just inflation. It wasn't real rising prices, and so it didn't get us anywhere. So then, since then, macroeconomics has gone off in the direction of what the standard tool is now a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that's founded on rational representative agents. And I actually think there is some value in those models, but I think also that in some way the cure has been worse than the disease. And that by focusing exclusively on that, economics has really missed the boat and wasted 40 years. I want to make another comment along these lines, which is that one of the distinctions I've come to see is really useful in economics is structure versus strategy. Economists spend a lot of time thinking about strategic equilibria. That is, we're in a situation where I can reason about you and you can reason about me, and we both take each other into account. So we can use something like Nash equilibria and game theory to see where we would get if we fully take each other into account. And it is important to take the other guy's reasoning into account. But the problem is, if it leads you to making models that are solved in closed form, as DSG models are, then you're in a straitjacket, because you just can't model a very complicated situation that way. That goes back to my very first slide of where the breakthrough has come. You know, up until the 60s or 50s, we were stuck making closed form models. They almost had to be linear or we couldn't solve them. You know, now we've got computers, we can solve nonlinear things. The DSGE guys are really stuck in this straitjacket of their closed form models, and hence, what do? Because strategic reasoning is considered essential in an economic model. In fact, a model is deemed to not even have any economic content unless it has that in it. Then they sacrifice the structure. And that was what happened leading up to the crisis. DSGE models leading up to the crisis didn't actually have banks or liquidity as one of the, banks were not a agent in the model, and liquidity was not a variable, and so, not surprising, they didn't forecast the crisis. Now, since then, DSGE models are trying very hard to make those kind of things work, and they have a little bit of success, but I think the fact that such an important structural element in the economy was left out of the models is symptomatic of the broader problem. Now, why agent-based modeling? It diversifies the toolkit of economics. You know, if you really believe in diversity, as you know, Finance 101 would teach you you should, then you should try lots of approaches. And I would argue that's been one of the biggest problems in economics. Time is right. Computers are getting more powerful all the time. Hasn't really been tried yet, so I've made some wild estimates of how much effort has been spent on other methods versus agent-based models in economics. The answer, not much. There are successes elsewhere, increasingly, you know, in, say, epidemiology, traffic, or defense. Agent-based models are the state of the art. If, you know, you want to take a city and ask, we're going to make a diversion here, what will be the effect on traffic? It's been demonstrated, and it's now used in several cities, that you can get very good predictions about what will happen. And to counter Krugman, let me just say, I think agent-based modeling has already had some successes in economics. In particular, if you ask the question of why markets display clustered volatility, that is, markets are volatile and they're more volatile one day and less volatile the next day, and that's a persistent property. If the market's really volatile today, it's likely to be more volatile tomorrow than it is on average. Really, the only explanations come from agent-based models. In fact, the pioneers of those explanations were the Santa Fe stock market model that emerged in the mid-90s with Blake LeBaron, Brian Arthur, John Holland, and Richard Palmer. In other cases, like Rob Axtell has a model for firm size that does a very good job of explaining many of the features of firm size and the dynamics around labor and firms. Now, why would you go to an agent-based model? You can faithfully capture real institutions. You can get instabilities and feedback. DSGE models typically are engineered to be stable. So it means, you know, you can knock the economy out of equilibrium and look at how it relaxes back, but you have to believe that's the right picture. And whereas in an agent-based model, you can have inherent instabilities. You have a nonlinear dynamical system. You can have high-dimensional chaotic attractors. You can have the economy move into situations where it's more unstable than it usually is, and noise gets amplified, and so you actually create the shocks that you would have to impose exogenously in a DSGE model. It's easy to do policy testing. Just program the policy into your model. It's easy to incorporate behavioral knowledge. There's no need to assume rational expectations. And you know, my last bullet here, ABMs synthesize knowledge. If you have to build something, first of all, you learn a lot about it. I've learned a lot about economics in the last 3 years from building an agent-based model of the whole economy. And secondly, you understand what's not understood. If you put the best knowledge about each piece in, you push the start button and some garbage comes flying out, you might go, well, it's useless, but actually you start digging in and you go, this is where the garbage is coming from. You can pin down what it is that you're not doing right. Now, I don't want to argue that it's a panacea. You know, there's a lot of problems. There's a little prior art. You have to develop the right abstractions. It's always hard to know what to put in, what to omit. It's hard to keep the model simple yet realistic. And you generally get pushed towards more and more complicated models, and you have to resist that tendency, but not too much, as Einstein said. It can be hard to find the right data to calibrate agent-based models. You can have things like data censoring problems where you can't observe. The thing that you can observe is not the thing you really want to put in the model. I'll slough over that now because I don't want to run over time too much. There's no theoretical foundation, and I want to give the cautionary tale of weather forecasting. I brought up the method of analogs. Now, how was weather forecast prior to roughly 1980? What was the leading method for forecasting weather? Oli probably knows, or Chris knows. They probably heard me give this before. Okay, well, made you think about it a little bit. Do you really know? Well, there were these guys, because I think there were maybe there were a few women, though. I don't know. It was mainly guys. I always picture them with beards, and the weather maps would come in, and weather maps have been around since the beginning of the 20th century. And remember, this is before computers, so what they had was a big library of weather maps. And they would look at today's weather map, and they would go, reminds me of 1925. They'd start flipping through their book of weather maps, find this weather map in 1925, and go, yeah, it's kind of like this one. Rotated a little bit here because the wind's 20 degrees differently. Things are probably going to move faster because the wind's blowing harder now. They look forward the next day and they see what happens. They find a few of those, lick their finger, make a forecast, and that's what you'd read in the newspaper. Now, it happened I was an intern in graduate school, camped out on the Mesa at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, working with Ed Lorenz in the 1980s. And in 1980, I asked Ed, when are you going to be able to, because we've got the big Cray supercomputer that's probably less powerful than my iPhone now, but it was simulating, the weather of the economy, or sorry, the weather at the time. And I said, Ed, when are you going to be able to beat the traditional weather forecasters? And he said, well, we're holding even with them now. I think we're going to beat them pretty soon. And sure enough, right around then was a tipping point, and weather forecasts are way better now than they were in 1980 because they finally passed those guys. So that's the good news. What's the bad news? Well, when did the effort to do physical weather forecasting start? 1950. John von Neumann was looking for peacetime uses of the computer, and he teamed up with Rossby, who was the best physical meteorologist at the time, and they built a model. They ran it. They made forecasts for a couple of days, 12 hours ahead, and the forecasts were good enough that they said, they declared victory and the whole program set off, but good enough, they cherry-picked the case they forecast, it turned out, and it took them 30 years before they could beat the traditional weather forecasters. So it can be rather difficult to do these kind of things. Now I'm going to kind of skip over this. I'm going to skip over this model. I'm going to show you a qualitative model that actually does some realistic things. I'll say a little bit about it. Okay, I'll say a little bit about it. We have some funds. We have a bank. We have investors. We have a noise trader. We have value investors. We get evolutionary booms and busts in the market. We get clustered volatility. The volatility even looks a bit like realized volatility. We actually get clustered volatility and heavy tails from the crises that are happening in this model when you have leverage crises that very much resemble ones that are seen in real markets. We also got some surprising results out, like we can look at the rate at which defaults are happening as a function of how much we let the investors leverage, and we can compare this under different regulatory schemes like Basel II, an unregulated scheme where you just, it's really not unregulated, we just put an absolute cap on leverage. Another one where you make people buy options, and we see the result that for low leverage, these regulatory regimes result in lower default rates, but for high leverage, they actually make things worse. And P.S., we're a bank's operating somewhere up here. Now, I'm actually going to skip the housing model too because I think I'm running out of time. I want to just, I'll just say we also have a model with Rob Axtell and John Giannakopoulos, two other SFI mainstays for the housing market of Washington, D.C., where we actually try to make time series predictions with a housing model. And just to give you a feeling, this is somewhat overfit. I don't fully believe our model's this good. But we can match the actual observed housing bubble. So we're going from 97 to 2010 here. We're looking at the Case-Shiller index for Washington, D.C., and we compare the data to the model. And then we can do things like make counterfactual policy experiments where we, for example, hold interest rates constant through the period. You can see the bubble gets damped, or we can hold lending policy constant through the period, in which the case the bubble just gets eliminated. And so, so we think we can get useful policy information out of such a thing. Now, I've been devoting the last few years to building what I use the word complete here. I think the proper word is actually comprehensive agent-based model of the economy. That is, so far there's only, well, one or two, depending on what you count, examples of other models in which people have really tried to model the main agents in the economy all at once, namely households, firms, banks. Those are sort of the fundamental things you absolutely need to have to start to get the whole picture, and as well as other things like mutual funds. The central bank, of course, plays an important role. The key is to have both financial markets and macro in the same model, because if anything has beaten us over the head in the lesson of the crisis of 2007-8, it's that you can't think about the macroeconomy and the financial markets separately because they're so tightly linked. And you know, things like the Reinhard Rogoff book, This Time is Different, underscores that. Now, let me just say, so our model at this point looks like this. We have all of the actors that I listed in there. We actually keep adding more. We've got a government. We've got shadow banking system now. And I'll just show you a recent result of it that I got together with Christoph Eimans, whose name should have been on the slide here. It's a bit like the first model I showed you, but in the first model I showed you, the agents were hedge funds. We formulated that model actually pre-crisis, and so we were still thinking about LTCM, the long-term capital management crisis, as an example of the kind of thing we were worrying about. So the agents that were the dynamics were coming in were hedge funds. In the 2007-8 crisis, it was banks. And so we're doing that in this model here. And what do we see? Well, we see that if we don't regulate the agents at all, we just give them some starting leverage and we let them just passively go on making investments without controlling their leverage, we see, okay, things fluctuate, but they're reasonably stable. If, on the other hand, we have them use Basel II, so in Basel II what happens is that if you have higher volatility, banks are required to lower their leverage and vice versa, which I think that's in my next slide. Anyway. When they do that, what we actually get is now an endogenous oscillation. So we now get these big oscillations where, in fact, the time scale roughly matches. These are the kind of great moderations in here. We typically then see this bubble and a crash. And this goes back to Chris's question about equilibria versus internal inherent dynamics. This is a system where it's quite clear from other things we've done, and let me actually show you the next slide. We can actually reduce this all the way down. I mean, the simulation I showed here has several banks, several assets, more complicated stuff going on. This simulation, we reduce it down to a single bank, a single asset. We make some fixed equity assumption to really simplify it dramatically. We get very similar looking dynamics. And we can now make a phase plot where actually we're plotting volatility today, essentially, against volatility yesterday, and smooth volatility. And so what happens in this system, well, I need to make a movie, but basically you start out in a fairly volatile world with a fairly high leverage limit. Fairly low leverage limit. And then you slowly move down this unstable manifold. So these dots kind of creep down like that. As you creep down, volatility gets lower and lower. Leverage gets higher and higher, which makes the system more and more unstable. And finally, it gets unstable enough that even though you have a low volatility, you kick out, you bounce around this space for a while, and then you eventually get back on the stable manifold and repeat the cycle. And so that's actually the essence of what's going on in our more complicated model. I think I have one more slide showing it. Here we have it in a 5D, more accurate representation with some noise and so on. But it's the essence of what's happening in this model. And coming back to Chris's question, there is no equilibrium. The only thing that's close to an equilibrium is this hyperbolic, unstable hyperbolic fixed point here, but you can never sit on that point because it's infinitely unstable. And so, so there is no equilibrium. You're on a chaotic attractor all the time. And so lessons for the early warning things, ideas that are based on equilibrium, critical point kind of notions, I'm a little skeptical, to be honest. But, you know, I mean, I'm open-minded, but again, my experience is if you want to do a good job, the devil's in the details. So I want to wrap up by just saying that we have a lot of work to do to make models that can seriously compete with DSG. The problem with the approach I'm talking about here, compared with the approach in the previous talk, is pretty easy to do quick and dirty things, and they might be useful, so it's worth doing. But my argument here is if you really want to do it properly, you have to make a proper model. Proper models require mastering a lot of details. It turns into a kind of ugly engineering task. You know, I said in the slide, we've got to solve the chicken and egg problem. You know, with the weather forecasting in 1950, when von Neumann and Rossby and their team presented the results, everybody said, yeah, let's do that. You know, that's the way to go. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent following that program because every physicist believed it was the way to go. In economics, that hasn't been the case. We've got to actually get up to some point where we can demonstrate enough success to start pulling the rest in there. So we have a chicken-egg problem because Paul Krugman will say, you haven't done it yet, I don't believe it, therefore I don't support it. But you know, on the other hand, I think it's something you can't do in your kitchen. You know, my experience at Prediction Company was I really needed a team of 20 people to beat the market the way we beat the market, which was, again, maybe this is the kind of guy I am, it's sort of the hard way. We actually got in there and figured a lot of stuff out. I think economic models of the future will be agent-based models, but when that will happen, I don't know. And I think really good early warnings will require confronting the devils that are in all these details. So.
Thank you, Don. I'm sure we have some questions.
You guys were surprisingly quiet while I was talking.
Ole,
you always have questions.
I have to say something. Can I get a microphone?
2 microphones, Ole.
Does this work? Yeah. Well, so first of all, thank you very much, Doyne, and I applaud all your efforts there, but I can't help myself from commenting on the DSGE models. So I know that you were talking about ABMs, but I think you were pretty soft on them. For instance,
soft on DSG or soft on
you were soft on DSG. Yeah. So for instance, you said they are based on rational agents. I think that's a funny way of putting it, and I know you will agree with it. They are not based on rational agents. They are based on absolutely crazy agents. It's just that economics has defined them as rational, and this is a real problem. And this comes back to what the paper that Tim was referring to earlier on, this idea of what are they optimizing. And at the moment, the thing they're optimizing, the thing that is considered rational in economics, is this imagined average over parallel universes in the future, and that just makes absolutely no sense. And we can correct that, and well, you know that is my direction. So I'm taking these DSGEs and I'm saying there's something really fundamentally wrong with them, and let's see what happens if we correct some of those flaws. And the other comment I can't help myself making is you said, it's not important, but you said that numerical weather prediction started in the 1950s. Richardson did this in World War I. And so his idea was exactly the same, to say, well, I'll take some weather maps and data and I start integrating the equations of motions forward, and I will make a numerical weather prediction. This is basically what kept him sane during World War I, as he was driving an ambulance during the day instead of picking up dead bodies, and he spent his nights somewhere in a trench doing these mindless calculations for several years to integrate, I think, 12 hours into the future, by which time the instabilities in the full Navier-Stokes equations had completely blown up, and that failed. So that's just
okay.
Yeah.
So let me just the Richardson. It's an interesting story. So I apologize for leaving that out, but I think it was actually the 20s when he finally. Anyway, published papers later, but in fact, so Richardson had the vision. And he worked out all these schemes. He actually did the arithmetic by hand to solve the partial differential equation in order to make a weather forecast. Now, in fact, his forecast was bad, and it's been since shown that it's bad because he made mistakes in the actual calculation. But in fact, Richardson set things back a lot because people respected Richardson, and the fact that his forecast didn't work very well gave people pause about going down that path. And so it wasn't picked up again until 1950 with von Neumann and Rossby. I don't want to contest what you said about DSGE models. I do think that, agent-based modeling gives you an appreciation that you've got to be very careful about the decision rules. The hard part in an agent-based model is getting reasonable decision rules. And you can have a problem because you put in a decision rule that seems, you ask somebody, what do you do? Like you ask a banker, what do you do here? You put it in. And then you run your model and you see your model doing something really stupid because actually what the banker said didn't fully capture what they actually do. And so you get stuck with a model doing some idiotic thing that you have to discover the hard way. So it's not actually a bad starting point to make your agents kind of as smart as you can get them and make them deal with stuff. And then you can try to detune them to be more realistic. That debate, by the way, I was first exposed to the debate, well, actually when I was 18 years old in economics class. But it was underscored for me in 1986, I believe it was, when SFI had a conference called The Economy as an Evolving Complex System. And Ken Arrow picked his team, and Phil Anderson picked his team, physicists. And so the physicists and the economists slugged it out for 2 weeks. And basically, the economists explained economics to us in the first couple of days, and the physicists we had our jaws hanging open with the rational expectations part because we said people just aren't that way. And I like to think we actually had a little bit of influence because people like Larry Summers, who were staunchly defending rational expectations at the time, subsequently published papers with non-rational, showing that people actually are not rational. So Tom Sargent's another person who was heavily influenced by SFI.
Doyne, thank you. Can I ask you to go back to one of your last bits? So it was it's your model and the next slide on. So the chaotic attractor.
Right.
And I suppose my question boils down to, is this an artifact of your model, or, in your opinion, your belief, whatever, do you think that this is in some way representative of the real world?
I think it's in some way representative of the real world, though this is far from a calibrated simulation of the real world. I mean, we actually intentionally, and we saw this oscillation happening. I can actually tell you a little bit more the path we followed. When we first started simulating banks, and having banks hold fixed leverage targets, there's good empirical evidence that that's more or less what banks do. At any given point in time, the bank has a notion, we want to leverage around X. And so we're going to manage our investments to hit that leverage. And so, if our leverage gets above, we're going to sell assets. And if our leverage goes below, we're going to buy assets. Well, how does that actually work? What drives your leverage above is that prices fall. So what are banks doing? Banks are selling into falling markets, and they're buying into rising markets. And P.S., when we first started to simulate the banking system, we went, it's unstable. And we thought, we must be doing something wrong. And we thought about it a minute and said, well, no, it's got to be unstable. You've got to have other investors around to stabilize it. So the banking system is unstable all the time by itself. It needs the rest of the world to stabilize it. One of the things you learn when you actually have to build one, right? It's not that other people kind of sort of didn't know it, but somehow it slams you in the face when you have to first make the mistake, then get it right. So we had to build in these noise traders to represent the rest of the economy. Now, we saw these oscillations, and I actually had a slide. Initially, we saw them in a much noisier way. But then we zoomed in on it. What's driving the noisy oscillation? So here we're trying to get a model that just represents the essence of the phenomenon. So the essence is that because if you start out in a state where you have high volatility and low leverage, because in order to compute, to estimate volatility, people use a smoother, use a low-pass filter. Okay? So the perceived volatility tends to slowly drop with time, which is what's happening up here as a result of the endogenous dynamics. As it drops, the leverage goes up, which is actually generating a bit more volatility, but the smoothing wins out. And then finally you get the leverage way too high and you have a crisis and you kick off. I think that's, in a certain sense, the essence of what happened with the Great Moderation and the crisis of 2008. Now, this is by no means an exact model. It's just, an abstraction of the thing. But I think our agent-based model does have, when we use this it has this hyperbolic fixed point sitting in there, and it's playing an important role in organizing what's going on, but it's now a higher dimensional chaotic attractor, not a low dimensional one like here. It's a lot harder to see clearly what's really happening because of all the noise. And so, what we're really shooting toward is being able to move back and forth between much more realistic models and then stylized representations that give us the intuitive feeling of what's happening. But the whole basic way of looking at it is not the way an economist would normally look at it, because we're saying, well, it's a high-dimensional chaotic attractor with an unstable fixed point on it. There's no equilibrium, unless you want to call the invariant measure of the whole chaotic attractor the equilibrium, which maybe you could.
So very compatible with Minsky's financial.
Very compatible. This is a very Minsky-like explanation.
Over here. While the microphone's going there, let me just ask you, do you believe it's widely understood that, as you contend, the banking system left to its own self, that is, without noise traders, without the rest of the system, is unstable?
No. I think it's because, the mindset of thinking in dynamical systems terms is not as, and thinking in terms of feedback loops is not as well propagated in economics as it should be. I mean, increasingly, I think economists are starting to worry about feedback loops.
If you wrote an op-ed piece to that effect, what would Krugman's reaction be?
Probably something along the lines of the slide I showed earlier. I don't know. Economists are quite happy to criticize economics from within or criticize each other, but they don't like getting it from outside.
That point seems to me to be A, so fundamental, B, so obvious once you make it in terms of the nature of the feedbacks between leverage and banking action, that once it were made that clearly, I think it would be a huge contribution.
Well, we'll try, Chris. And actually, Krugman might well agree. I don't know. I can't say. Tobias Adrian, who's an important researcher at the Fed, and who's been one of the leaders in understanding these kind of things, I think he would pretty much agree with this. He would somewhat say, he has a DSG model actually that has some dynamics that are kind of similar to this, but I would argue that the DSG model sort of obscures getting right down to what's going on. He doesn't have a simple picture like this with a hyperbolic fixed point sitting in it and a statement that it's the endogenous dynamics on a high-dimensional chaotic attractor that's actually causing the problem.
I think earlier on you showed some charts with endogenous risk in a simple model, and it looked like the structure of that model included investors and funds, and I was just wondering the sensitivity of that. Is it more important around the selection decisions of investors or the mix of strategies in the funds, or kind of when you were building it and looking at the results, which kind of areas were more important in driving that?
Yeah. So, several things are important. So first of all, just to distinguish the two models, so here's the diagram of the first model that I slept over because I realized I was talking too much and running out of time. So there we had a bunch of different funds, and the funds differed because they were aggressive in different amounts. And there we get a leverage cycle. It's a bit different in nature. It looks more like this. So we've got these bursts where the funds do well. This is the wealth of the funds versus evolutionary time. So these periods where the funds do quite well, and actually when the funds are doing well in this model, not a fully realistic aspect of this model, but they're all value investors in this model. And so they're actually, under normal circumstances, damping volatility because they buy when the market's going down and they sell when the market's going up. So they're actually stabilizing and damping the volatility, but their leverage creeps up because they're competing with each other. The most aggressive guys get more than the other ones, so the leverage slowly creeps up. Then something happens to trigger a crash, and a bunch of the funds go out of business, and the cycle repeats itself. And when the funds go out of business, the value investors are gone, and so you get high volatility again. So that's the stylized view of what's happening in this model. Now, your question was about, well, do the style of investment matter? Yes. This model produces, as I mentioned, heavy tails. So, okay, these are returns. This is the probability that you get return bigger than a certain size. And so, without any leverage, the biggest return you'll ever see is around 15%. In other words, you never have big crashes in the model. When you start letting the investors leverage, now you get crashes where in one day the market will lose 40% of its value. So you have a big difference in terms of the extreme events as a result of having leveraged value investors. But you asked about ecology. Well, so there's a little bit of ecology in this because you're seeing an ecological fluctuation between more aggressive funds and less aggressive funds. After the crash, the less aggressive funds can emerge and dominate for a while, but eventually the more aggressive funds, because they do a bit better, they suck in all the money from the investors. In this quiet world of the moderation, they attract the capital, leverage creeps up. So it's an ecological fluctuation. There's another kind of ecological fluctuation that was what was in the original SFI stock market model, which is between trend followers and value investors. You can get, and that's the first known cause of heavy tails and clustered volatility in prices. Here's a secondary cause. There's probably at least these two causes, and these which are both ecological in nature. Well, and there's a question of what here. We used a dummy bank and lots of funds. In the other model, we use a network of banks, and the banks. The action involves the banks, and the fact that the banks have this fixed leverage target. And whereas with these funds, they're destabilizing only when they get fully leveraged, which is only once in a while when they have great opportunities. Banks are fully leveraged all the time, so they're destabilizing all the time. So, and there are ecological effects there too. I don't think we understand them as well. Did I answer your question?
I guess it would be interesting. I suppose you can vary this. I suppose you could vary the preference for investors to switch from a fund they deem to be bad to good,
What?
and whether that has what impact that has either, I guess, on the time it takes for the system to reach a critical point.
Yeah. So let me, I slept by explaining what this model actually does, but in fact we use what's sometimes called the intensity of choice formalism. It goes back originally to Gibbs, although he used it in physics. But here what it means is that investors are looking for a higher return, and they switch with some probability. As the returns get better, consistently better, they switch with higher probability. And so the dynamics of that does affect the time scale and abruptness with which these changes happen, and affects the instability. And that, by the way, is often one of the hard things to get right in an agent-based model. When you build it in a simple way without enough heterogeneity in it, typically things run much too abruptly and are much too unstable. So you have to actually tune the model by making things more heterogeneous and more smooth to get things more realistic. But that's also true here. We can tune. In this case, actually, it has to do with how how attracted the investors are to the different funds. If this fund is better than this fund, how quickly will the money flow into this fund? that will affect the time scale and level of instability in the model.
Other questions? Two in the back.
Hi, I got lost at one point. Do banks have a fixed leverage target because of Basel II, and it's an artifact of regulation, or is there something else driving
Right.
it?
So in the latter model, at any point in time, the banks have a leverage target that's smoothly changing. Now, Basel II is what's causing the smooth changing, because the way Basel II works is to say, let's look at historical volatility over the last few years. If volatility's been high, volatility is likely to be high going to the future. Therefore, we better have a lower leverage target because we know that higher leverage is less stable. Well, actually, the first cause would be higher leverage leaves the banks more exposed to risk. So therefore, if risks are higher because volatility is higher, we should have a lower leverage limit so that they're safer. And so that's the rationale. And the rationale, in a world where none of the banks have systemic effects, that rationale is quite sensible. The problem is banks do have systemic effects because the aggregate of all the banks is a significant piece of what's going on in the system. And so you get the kind of endogenous dynamics that I showed you in my later slides where the banks themselves actually drive this dynamics of the great moderation followed by a crash. And because Basel II is actually ultimately causing that. So, Ken?
I was just going to offer some reflections as a climate modeler and a sometime ecological modeler. I mean, I support the philosophical quest here. I was thinking partly about when you're mentioning weather forecasting, the reason the forecast's so good now is they've got very sophisticated data assimilation coming in, and I guess that's why you were mentioning right at the start of the talk the idea of streaming data in off the internet into a true, when it's an initial condition problem, you obviously need to get the initial conditions right. But clearly what you're doing with the models now is not that. It's much more a fundamental, let's change the structure of the model, let's play with these feedback mechanisms, let's see how that affects the dynamics. And we, of course, do the same thing in climate and ecological modelling, and that's actually a lot closer to what climate models do on the longer integrated timescale. But I was thinking about your kind of sociological problem here of, can we convert economics to basically a broader zoo of types of modelling approaches? And I think there might be some mileage in not just pushing for the highest end maximum complexity agent-based approach, which you're promoting eloquently, but certainly in climate modelling we also use much simpler dynamical systems models, and we use a Lorentz model, which is after all only 3 equations, an awful lot as well, because we get insight from those simpler feedback models, exactly as you're articulating in some of the earlier discussions. So to make a pitch, I mean, I would just imagine there might be a pitch to the community that says, well, actually there's value in what we would call a hierarchy of models that are somewhat traceable between the full complexity and the very reduced form models. And in a sense, what Bob May showed us earlier was very simple dynamical systems models for the problem. So I suggest kind of as an enlightened community, we maybe make a pitch that way.
Yeah. No, I totally agree that one wants to go back and forth between something really, really simple like this and something more complex like this. I was partly using it to illustrate that we first actually saw this, and then we said, can we strip it down? Yeah. So we stripped it down to this 2D map to get at the essence of what we thought we were seeing in the simulation. And I think that's a very important thing to do. There is a fundamental problem I didn't touch on too much here with making forecasts with agent-based models. So I'll admit that mostly what we're doing right now is doing policy experiments where we say, we think we've got sort of what the qualitative thing of how this works, let's do a policy experiment, try different policies. I would like to be able to do 4-point forecasts, but there's a fundamental problem there, which is that an agent-based model has a lot of unobservable or unmeasurable microstates in it. And so you may be able to observe the macro states like the employment and so forth, but you don't know what all these microstates are doing. And yet you've got to put in something there. And if you don't put in the right reasonable stuff for those microstates, you get bad transients that knock you off the attractors and cause weird stuff to happen. And so this is actually a fundamental problem that we're working on the right way to solve in agent-based models. And actually, now that I think about it, maybe you guys have dealt with this in climate, so I should find out what you've done there. Because until we solve that, we can't really make good time series forecasting models, because you tend to just get crazy stuff. Because the problem is you put your model in the known state, macro states for now, you let it run for a year, you let the real world runs for a year, they aren't the same. Now you've got to take your model and put it back in the state of the real world. When you do that, you introduce these problems that generate big transients. And so I see you nodding vigorously.
I was going to say, talk to Tim Palmer, also at Oxford Royal Society research professor. You rightly gave the example of clouds, because to model clouds properly, you can't do it still in a global model. You make a mesoscale model and try and resolve the processes. You want to fix that in the global model. What Tim would argue is you use some clever stochasticity. You introduce some stochasticity into the unresolvable aspects of your model, and that can actually sometimes help.
Yeah.
But it's an imperfect fix.
Yeah.
But it'd be a fruitful line of conversation.
Well, it's great that you mentioned Tim Palmer. I actually have been meaning to invite him over to dinner. So, as it happens, it was on my to-do list to send Tim a note. So I will do that, and I'll ask him about this specifically, because we probably rather would have talked about playing guitar or something else.
Cricket. He plays cricket.
He plays cricket. Okay. Right.
That seems like a great time to thank Doyne once again.